Hey, Alex here. You might also know me as Radio Runner on Instagram. Welcome to my YouTube channel where I help you guys learn how to become more effective artists. We're going into another plein air workout today, so I'm just gonna hop right into it. Feel free to slow down the video, mute it so you don't have to listen to me slurring with the words all slowed down, and I hope you guys learned something from this. Alright, so the first thing that I like to do when I get into these plein air studies is to do a gestural line sketch underneath. Now, I've personally been trying to be more conscious of my shape design from references and work on flow, gesture, all of that stuff. I usually struggle with, and maybe you guys do too, when I use a photo reference, I feel like I have to be beholden to the image if I'm studying from it, but really that's just replication. So when you go through a process like this, think about, okay, what is the essence of what's going on here? We've got this path that is receding down to the house. I want to try and exaggerate how large it feels in the foreground and how narrow it feels in the background to accentuate the perspective. With the mountains, I simplify and use a gestural free-flowing curve to aid with that. And of course, I chose this image because of that great cloud pattern. But especially with a limited time painting like this, I'm not going to try to paint all of those individual shapes. Instead, I'm going to think about a gestural arc and paint that in later instead. So I'm just getting in the foreground endings so that I know where the water should be. And now we're putting in our first layer to give the background. So much like traditional, I am working from back to front, where I will give myself, I guess they would call that a wash typically, but I'll usually just set one full color. And I have two different approaches that I'll do with sky colors. I'll either do a flat color and use my grainy airbrush to get a gradient, or I'll use a textural oil brush and get a really grimy and gritty kind of sky. But with a bright one like this, I'd rather just get the nice gradient since it's a clear, beautiful open sky. Now the reason I did just a rectangle here is because I was working quickly and I didn't want to bother with selecting out the water shape yet, but that was just a preference thing. I'll go in and delete that eventually. Right now I think it was mainly so that I knew where the overlap of the ground should be of the horizon line, and I could put the mountain underneath with my layers and not have to worry about it. Okay, so what you see me doing here is a way that I've found to use Lasso. Instead of trying to get all of the details in the first take, I'll get the main core idea of the lasso shape so that I can get that off the bat, and then I'll go in and add the rest of the jagged edges so that I can refine the main gesture. Okay, so I set in a clipping mask into my mountain. I am now going to paint in the light, which would be all of the greens and the desaturated browns that I see in the image. I'm leaning towards a coolish color because I know that this is in the background and it's going to be affected by atmospheric perspective. You guys have probably heard of that before. All that means is that the further things receded away into space, especially in environments, the more of it, the particulate in the air is going to obfuscate what you are able to see. So contrast is reduced some. You'll see a lot of blues in the shadow colors. You'll see a lot of blues even in the light tones. It's a bit of a balance here because there are still some warmish, maybe desaturated colors and tones in the mountain. And so it's just something you have to wrestle with. Okay, so I set up a layer behind the mountain, and I'm working on laying in the clouds now. Bit of a problem-solving process here. You see me unify the shapes, because originally I tried drawing each of them individually, and I just didn't like it. Now, something to think about with clouds is that they are 3D shapes. They are forms, and I think a lot of people may not get that off the bat, but you can think of them as large boxes or the top half of spheres receding into the sky. So things closer to the image or closer to the camera are going to be larger, and clouds will recede into space. They have an underplane, a side plane. You can often light them in the same way that you would a sphere. So to get these shapes, I am just cutting away into the lasso shapes that I had before with a dry oil brush, is what it's called. A lot of people make brushes like that, so if you find something similar, it should be the same thing. And I'm cutting away shapes that I like, trying to get some wispy texture, so I'm not pressing lightly, meaning I'm not erasing all of it at once. When I put in my initial cloud tone, I didn't use a pure white so that I could go in and lay in the light color, which would be pure white here. So while I do this, I'm keeping in mind the underplane of the clouds, which allows you to maintain dimensionality. You can then round off the light values by using smudges or using a brush to kind of add some loose edges. So it's a matter of cutting, finding the shape design, discovering what you like. And clouds aren't really, while they are 3D forms, they're not really hard-edged solids. So the more you can have a shape, which helps by defining it with your lasso tool or cutting into it, and having a mix of hard and really soft edges, either with your brushwork or blending away, smudging away, for instance, it's really going to add to the wispiness and the, just the airiness of a cloud. My tone was too dark there. I picked too dark of a blue, so I needed to paint it away. Alright, going back into the mountains, and we're filling in more of the light that I missed the first time around. Now, I was talking in the Discord with some people after airing the first video, and it was asked, I use the lasso tool all the time, and yeah, I do. I use it for everything. Once I discovered it, I don't like to paint with normal brushes, because, in my opinion, it is a lot more time intensive to use brushes. Yeah, you'll get a lot more of that traditionalist appeal in there, but I like the hard-edged starting that way, and then working out your edges once you get your lasso shape in. But they had asked, doesn't it seem kind of limiting to only work in lasso? Are there any disadvantages to it? And I think I don't personally feel limited, because I would think anytime you want to paint something in, if you want to get a mountain shape like this, then you're going to have to brush that in. You either have to use a really small brush size and then fill it in, or you're going to have to cut away, and you have to work it. You have to go back and forth, paint, erase, paint, cut into it. And then you have to watch for your lines until you lock the transparency. So it's able to afford you that. The Lasso tool also has you work in a drawing mindset again. You can think directly about shapes instead of blobs with painting. I see a lot of traditionalist painters, they're great, but they'll often start with loose information and they'll refine it over time. And I don't like to work that way, so I don't like to go in and find the details. I want to go and say, this is the shape, this is what I'm working inside. So by doing that, I make large shape decisions and I fill that in with color and texture variation using extra large brushes. So you get that edge control while still having some painterly information. I find a lot of the times the Lasso is cutting steps out, at least for me. I have to deal with less if I do the Lasso and just say this is exactly what I want to do, like for the house right now. I've got the precise house shape and I don't have to deal with it anymore. So as I was talking, you probably saw me put in a reflection. Real simple. All I did was copy out the mountain that I had done. I made sure to work it to a reasonable amount of detail first before copying it, but you can just flip it vertically and clip it into the water space, the shape that you make for it, and clip it inside. And essentially what you do is lower the transparency some, maybe darken it so that it's not the exact same value. Some light information is lost in a reflection. And then you can motion blur it if you have that available in your program. If you motion blur vertically, it's like it's stretching across the water. If you're to Gaussian blur it, Gaussian blur is more of a radial and it defocuses rather than having a directionality to it. So I picked it up from my instructor Kenny Vo at Brainstorm. He usually prefers to start off with a motion blur first, since he can add a bit of flow or shape to his blur choices. And then if he really needs to, he'll Gaussian blur that. But since talking about that with him, I found I don't Gaussian blur as much anymore. Since this is so far away on the house, I didn't feel like I needed to make my window shapes match perspective. It's so far away, it's a long lens that I just used a rectangular shape lasso and just quickly got them in so that I could work as fast as possible. If this were to be a long, detailed painting, it would be a different story. Alright, so here's a time-saving technique. I picked this up from Nikolai Lakertson. He shares his brushes. This is a gravel brush that he uses. And he'll put in just picking some color tones for the ground that he wants, and erasing away, putting it in. You skew that into perspective so that you can instantly have some texture to your ground. And it maintains, like the perspective depth. If you were to use brushes are very 2D, very graphic shapes, and you have to work a lot harder to make sure that works in perspective. So when we're working on a time limit like this is a very easy way to get started. It's not the end though. The ground in the reference does have some tread marks from being driven on a lot. So I want to make sure that comes in just a little bit. So I start painting into the texture that I have. I covered a bit in the first plein air workout that grasses and greenery in nature is a lot more yellow than you typically think. And you can really see that in this reference image where the edges towards the road are yellow. Grasses I'm not very experienced with, so this was a bit of a problem-solving thing for me. I know that working in large shapes is usually the way to go, then you cut back into them. So since I saw these through lines of dark shadow shapes, I went in with what would be the shadow color, and then tried to paint over it with some color variation since I do only have flat color on this grass. I should have added some texture to that first if I were to do this again, because the finished image is a little underwhelming in density, information density. If you guys are to try this out yourself, maybe you like what I'm doing, maybe you have a better technique, feel free to share that with me, because grasses are not the easiest for me. I definitely need to work on that. Organics in general, it's all problem solving on how to best simplify them. Here I'm adding a lot of the pebbles and grain that's in the foreground, making sure that stretches into perspective. So a good way to really sell grass is that you have overlap. You can see the silhouettes of grass strands coming up. Otherwise, it's really hard to understand what you're looking at other than just shapes of color. Grass brushes help solve that problem very quickly, but you can use it with traditional brushes as well. It would be more impressionistic. So I'm defaulting to my oil brush again, which is it has a really nice texture to it and some jagged edges that can kind of look like grass if you use it properly. And I'm working that in from the edges to get some of those shadow shapes for the yellow. This brush I found in Mike McCain's free brush pack on Gumroad. Mike McCain is a beast of a painter, by the way, if you guys don't know him. And it's this shrub brush that when you use it radially, it makes a bunch of sticks, and was kind of intended, I think, for like desert bushes. But if you can control it with your lasso shape, you can get this really interesting texture. And there is another distinct benefit to using the lasso, is you can get these unique textures in defined, confident shapes. Of course, it's still a little weird to just have like some sort of pentagon, weird polygonal thing So if you break into the silhouette by adding on away from it or eating away from it with a brush, you'll add to the naturalistic feel. Alright, so you saw me label atmosphere. I use my big grainy soft brush, and I'll take the lightest color of the sky, and I'll paint it into what I consider the background to really make sure that I'm selling the atmospheric perspective that I talked about earlier. What I do is I take that sky color, and on a normal layer I'll use a soft airbrush, and it kind of imbues and eliminates a lot of the contrast with the sky color. That way it's a little more implied that it really is setting back into space. It doesn't fully match for reference, but that is kind of an artistic choice on our part. We're coming across the end now, so I am on an overlay layer, and I am just looking to see where I can inject color, maybe the deepness in the blues, or overall unifying a palette in different areas. I often like to vignette the edges that are away from the focal area, so I'm just experimenting with different tones and seeing what I want. You can see how I'm comparing the before and after with that overlay, and by adding the bright yellow and kind of vignetting the back, it kind of just pushes the eye towards the center. I made sure to bring the darks down to make sure that typically you have stronger contrast in the foreground and midground than you do in the background because of atmospheric perspective. So I wanted to make sure that it remained dark so that you knew that it was in front of the mountain. Controlling your value grouping like that is admittedly more difficult in color, but you will eventually get an eye for it. What you see me trying here is I'm trying to add some darkness to the foreground and see if that works. But it's a bit of a weird balance since it is such a bright and sunny day. It's probably not the best choice. Okay, so that was our workout for today. Expect to have at least a few more of these. I've already got 6 recorded, and I aim to maybe put out 1 or 2 a week. And if you like this, let me know. So I'm happy to keep doing these. We'll probably, after the plein air workouts are done, we'll get into, I've gotten some requests to do a workout on the Asaro head, as well as I'm thinking of doing material and rendering studies, and you guys can learn along with me. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe down below. It's happy talking with you. I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you had a good painting session. See you in the next one.